Wait. Okay, Chautanga.
We're on.
We're on. A very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to another exciting show of Friday Drinks. And this time around, we don't have the pilot.
We don't have.
Ranga is away. How do you feel about it?
So it's fantastic. We actually started an hour late last week with the producer in the house. Today, just the patient's taking over the asylum. We are like literally 5 minutes within the prescribed start time.
So what can we say? That the problem is actually Ranga.
Producer, absolutely.
Did you hear that, Ranga? You are the problem. But it's spring.
Yeah, I'm enjoying the sunny weather. Although surprisingly, this time last year and previously, or perhaps I'm just biased and my memory is not serving me well, but it gets quite nippy in the morning and at night, which is not normal. Is that normal for this part of the world?
Well, it's still a change. Remember, it's still a change from winter to spring, right?
Yeah, but by September, it'll be warm in the morning. It was warm in the evenings. Now you have to have a jacket or jersey nearby.
In the morning.
After dusk.
After dusk. Yeah. In the evening.
Not so much, but I think in the evening.
In the evening, I agree.
You need to be mindful, otherwise you'll catch a cold.
Yeah. No, that's true. But I'm not complaining. I think that Zim summers tend to be extremely hot. So if it's cool, I'm happy with it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But I'm having a
very pink drink.
A very spring hibiscus. So, yeah. And what are you having?
I'm back to, my favorite whiskeys. I'm having another whiskey from the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And it's called the True Breath of Hebrides. And I don't know whether you know about Hebrides, but it's basically
absolutely
a bunch of islands off the west coast of Scotland. Okay. And so it's basically named after that place. And they usually have very colorful descriptions, so I'm just going to read it out. I don't think I can do a better job
Please go ahead.
Than them in terms of describing what they've put together here. So it's peat smokes, so it's a peaty whiskey. It's smoky on the nose. Maple pecan pastries and acacia honey, beach bonfires, licorice, tar, sea breezes, and lemon over seared scallops. So it's definitely a mix of very interesting flavors. In fact, when they had it on the outturn, it sold out quite quickly. And so this is probably one of the,
I feel the need to actually read out my ingredients and what it actually says about this Mutombo hibiscus. So it says potent in taste, flavor, nutrition, and health. The ingredients are known to contain significant amounts of vitamin C, zinc, iron, calcium. Okay, nothing interesting there. Okay, this is interesting. It says it has it's 100% organic hibiscus, rosella, ginger, oriental spices, and Mutombo magic.
Oh, fantastic! It's from our friend's daughter, isn't it?
Yes, Sakai.
No, okay, so shout out to her for introducing
I think it's a great summer drink.
This is one of the less boring things that you drink on the show, I must say. It looks quite interesting.
Well, it's got the Mutombo magic.
Fantastic. Have you ever been to the Mutombo show?
No, I haven't.
Is it called Mutombo? It's called Miombo. Okay, maybe I'm getting it horribly wrong.
I suspect so. And what's been happening in your week?
Oh, geez, it's been an interesting week. I think for me, I like to highlight the positives. Mm-hmm. And we saw the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe do a reversal on the NNCDs, the non-negotiable certificates of deposits that they'd issued out to corporates who were owed money from the auction, which were going to mature, I think, in 2 years. now they can offload them into the market if they want liquidity. So, I think that's a very positive development. It shows that the Reserve Bank has capacity to listen and make adjustments when the market pushes back on some of its policy actions. So, I'm heartened by that, and that's my biggest takeaway from this week. That
Well, that's extra liquidity in the market.
Well, it's not extra liquidity, because if I'm holding an NNCD, right, and I'm looking for liquidity, the person buying that NNCD, which is now tradable, off me, is basically giving up their liquidity and giving it to me. So it's not like it creates new liquidity. It just allows for people holding these pieces of paper to access liquidity if they need it, which I think is fantastic.
I think that's the difference between money supply and liquidity. So it was always money supply.
Yeah, for sure.
But it wasn't liquid.
Mm-hmm. Which is why they wanted it to be an NNCD, because they didn't want it to have an impact on liquidity.
So as far as money supply is concerned, it was always there. It was always included in our money supply, but it wasn't liquid.
For sure.
But now what they've done is they made it liquid.
Yeah, but it's not liquid dollar for dollar as well. I think that's an important thing to point out, because the market is going to place a discount on this paper, right? Because your counterparty on the other end is government of Zimbabwe, and it's unlike in the US where treasury paper is considered risk-free. In Zim, that's not the case. We've seen treasury bills trade at almost 50% discounts.
Anyway, we'll get into that, the second segment. I think we'll get into Zimbabwean news. I was genuinely asking about your week.
About my week?
Yes. And you're giving me a very Friday drinks answer, and that's not exactly what I was looking forward to. I'm actually concerned.
I'm in the mode.
No. We'll get into that. But I thought you had something exciting, something happening in your life. But since there's absolutely nothing, let's get on with the show. So, because Ranga is away, we can actually discuss whatever we want.
Absolutely.
And I just thought, let's have a debate about China-Africa relations. At least let's start there, because just to let the audience know, I think you would all have been aware, I think it was all over the news, that China-Africa conference that was in China, and we had close to 53 of the African states being represented by their presidents or prime ministers, which usually when these things occur, you never get all the presidents going. Zimbabwe has been there for the last week, and we had our president, Mnangagwa, touring a number of the states in China, the provinces in China, and meeting with all sorts of investors in China. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal for Africa. And just to color the landscape, what we know is the trade between Africa and China, it's now close to $300 billion US. With the US, it's closer to 50 billion US. And then EU is now the second largest. So China is now the largest. And this happened in 2022 when China became the largest trading partner with Africa. And then after that, it's the EU and then intra-African trade. But more significantly is the trade between China and Africa is actually growing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is investment by China into Africa. We saw the president of China, I think, making a pronouncement that they're actually going to invest $51 billion US into Africa. And on top of that, they're looking at creating 1 million jobs. And we've seen the investment in Africa from China evolving over the last 20 years. I think a lot of it was infrastructural spend, but now we're starting to see a lot of trade. Now, the way it's loop-sided, it has to do with what we're exporting and what we're importing. So we are actually exporting far less than what China is actually exporting into Africa, right? So what China imports in Africa is about a third of the trade. And then 2/3, it's what China is actually exporting
into Africa.
Africa, which I think colors the relationship, because a lot of people seem to think that China is here for minerals and infrastructure spend and all that. But it turns out that actually China sees Africa as a market and sees it as a growing market. Unlike everyone else. But I'm already giving away my views on this issue. So maybe to start off with, let's start with the China-Africa relations. And then, you're a philosopher, so I'd like to take it from a philosophical perspective. What's your view of that relationship and where it's coming from? I think because the context is global South relations.
So
These are not my words, but this is me just picking up from the newspapers and what they think.
I love this expression, the global South, because 90% of the world's population, fun fact, lives north of the equator. And China, all of China, is north of the equator. So when you talk about China being in the global South, it's hilarious to me. But I get it.
It's an ideological.
It's an ideological expression. It's like talking about the West.
Yeah, exactly.
So Japan is considered in the West, and Australia is considered in the West, even though geographically they're actually not
precisely. So
in the West.
We know this. So let's be clear.
But I think that we should do a better job of coining some of these geopolitical expressions and narratives. But that's not my only challenge with the idea of the global South, right? So there's, if you take the literal geography and put that on the side, if you think about the West geopolitically, they share quite a few values. They tend to be democracies. They tend to value free markets, and that's how they are predisposed economically and politically. And if you look at the grouping that we call the global South, they actually don't have that much in common. So China is not a democracy. They don't aspire to democracy. It's run by the Communist Party of China. South Africa is considered one of the big countries in the global South. It's a democracy. It's a liberal democracy, and they espouse free market capitalism. I don't know where you would put Brazil today, given everything that's happening there. Mm-hmm. India is considered the world's largest democracy, but they also have a lot of. It's also a very regulated market. It's not as open as a market like South Africa. So when we talk about the global South, it's really quite hard to say what is the common theme that binds them together, that brings them together. So
a shared history, right? These were mostly colonized nations. That's number one.
But the United States was a colony. Australia was a colony. Canada was a colony.
Every country in the world was colonized at some
exactly.
point. But we're talking about the 19th, 20th century colonization, right? The recent colonial history that a lot of the global South nations are bound together because they fought a common enemy. Which is actually true because the common enemy was mostly French and English, and they formed the non-aligned movement that India formed. But more importantly, a lot of the funding for the liberation struggle, especially where Africa is concerned, was funded primarily by Russia and China. So they do share a common history. I think we cannot wish that away. And then to your point on democracy, I think that you're laboring on that point more than it's worth. Because when you really think about it, a lot of liberal democracies, and you're really talking about political liberalism. And political liberalism, we could, for the purposes of this discussion, maybe look at it differently from economic liberalism. So if you look at what was then termed the third world, or developing countries, I think that's the politically correct term now. When you look at developing countries, a lot of them were in the global South, right? Mm-hmm. And so they shared a lot of that, and they were fast-growing economies, and they shared a lot of that. Now, in terms of political liberalism, yes, you might be right, but I think that's just one component. They do share a common thread, right? But I want to move away from the common thread because even if we were to run with your argument...
Oh, somebody owes us a bottle of whiskey. It's fantastic.
Well, that's the reason why we actually do need Ranga in the back. So if we talk about, political liberalism and how far democracy has... You're talking about maybe India is the longest serving democracy, and they got their independence in 1948. Right?
Yeah.
So you're talking about 70 something odd years, right? So if you think about it, these are new democracies, and I would not be as hard on them.
I'm not being hard on them.
The idea is if they don't share, they share a common vision that they all want to be democratic nations at some point.
China does not pretend to want to be a democratic country.
Well, I think you look at the movie. So if you look at China as a movie, and if the movie starts in 1948, and you look at where China is today.
Okay, for 1949 for China, yeah?
And where it is now, you can clearly see that China has fundamentally changed. And it's changing towards liberalism than it is towards dictatorial or totalitarian state. Now, that may not be true of the current setup in China at the present moment.
Yeah.
It might seem like they're regressing, but like I said, it might seem like they're regressing in the last decade. But if you look at it from the last 6 decades,
if you look at the longer arch.
Certainly
I hear you.
they're heading towards a particular. And if you look at, America is a 300-year-old democracy, right? So, and Europe even longer. You're talking about 1,000 years.
Well, no, Europe. Most of Europe was not a democracy just 150 years ago.
Yeah, but you're looking at maybe not democracy, but liberalism. So the idea of freedom and liberty, that they've held these ideas and these ideals for far longer periods than the global south. So I'm not making an excuse, but I'm just saying that we've taken a tangent that I didn't want us to take.
Well, the patients have taken over the asylum, so
we off-rammed.
We can take as many off-ramps and tangents as
we off-rammed, and that was good enough. But I want to talk about the economics, because that's really why we're here. The economics is that we're trading more and more with China and America. Sorry to say, and I want you to make the case for America, but America has just not been playing ball at all. And I'm not talking about Zimbabwe, but I'm talking about Africa. They're not interested in Africa. That's the truth.
So I think that's a very valid way of looking at it and characterizing it, right? Because the facts in terms of trade between Africa and the US speak to that, But I think facts can be interpreted differently, okay? And I think one of the challenges that we have here as Zimbabweans in particular, and as Africans in general, and I always say this when I speak to my fellow compatriots and Pan-Africanists, we have this challenge where I think we take ourselves too seriously. And the reason why I make that case is if you think about Africa as a continent, okay, there's 1.4 billion of us, right? Our continent is huge. You can fit all of territorial China, US, India into Africa and have millions of hectares of spare land, right? It's a huge continent. We have this massive blessing in natural resource endowment. Every mineral that you can think of is found in Africa. And then we have millions of hectares of arable land, right? So with that context, what percentage of global GDP would you think Africa makes up, right? You'd think it would be something material, like 25, 20, 15%. But actually, Africa contributes less than 3% to global GDP, right? We are bit players on the global stage, right? So, it's actually remarkable that we are significant trade partners to the Chinese, given how small we are in terms of our contribution to global GDP. So it's not so much that the Americans or Europeans or any other group is or isn't, playing ball. We are not players. We are not as important and relevant on the global stage as we think we are. Right, which is why, and this criticism is biting, but I think it's valid. You have all these countries. So China has a China-Africa summit, and you have 50 plus heads of state, flying over there. South Korea decides they want to have a South Korea-Africa summit, and all of us fly over there. The Russians decide they want to have a Russia-Africa summit, and lo and behold, we're all on a plane to wherever it is.
I'm not talking about Iraq and Russia and
No.
I'm
just
talking
saying,
about China. Let's stick to China.
No. The point I'm trying to make is when I speak to how all of these countries have these, name a country Africa summit, is that we are not actually we are so undeveloped. We contribute so little to global GDP that I would not make the case that the Europeans or Americans are not playing ball. I would make the case that we're not playing ball.
Okay, so I'd like to just push back on that because I know that you're a disciple of Caswell, and he really talks about the future and what the future will look like. Mm-hmm. And I think when the China-Africa relationship started, they were looking at Africa 2063. Mm-hmm. And it was a 50-year view. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese, their nature, their philosophy really looks at the long game. Mm-hmm. The long game. And they think, okay, where is Africa going? And it speaks to, Africa being the largest population in the next 50 years. It speaks to a huge market. And that's the thing that I want us to get into, because we need to change a particular paradigm. The paradigm is there's a lot of nonsense that's out there that says China is coming here to plunder our resources. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's not true. China looks at Africa as a potential market for its goods and services, and that speaks to the current trade. Now, when China looks at Africa, they say, okay, we want to trade with these guys. Mm-hmm. What do they have? Well, they have minerals. Okay, we'll take those. Right? Mm-hmm. But if you look at the trade, the $300 billion trade, 2/3 of it, it's actually coming from China, coming into Africa. Mm-hmm. So I think that China is looking at in the next 50 years, and they think that Africa will be a big market, right? So right now it might be 3% of GDP, but in the next 50 years, it will significantly be 3-4 times that. And I think that that's the mistake that America is making, because I think that the biggest export that America has right now, mm-hmm. It's its ideals of liberalism, which, by the way, I totally agree with. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, America made after World War II made a decision that their biggest export into the world will be liberalism, because the world is better under democracy or under liberalism or under mm-hmm. Some sort of freedom. I totally buy that Kool-Aid and I drink it fully. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But at this point in time, I think that what Africa needs is investments, it's business, it's trade. And at this point in time, I would say, to your point, Africa is insignificant, but it's going to be significant when you look at growth. And the only game or the only player in Africa that's making a significant inroad mm-hmm. is actually China. China is actually the only country that's actually taking Africa seriously.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. So you're making it, you're making this argument from a strategic geopolitical perspective, and I think there's some credit to that perspective. So I'll tell you, another perspective that I think is probably going to have a bigger impact on the future than the Chinese going out of their way to be closer to us in Africa. One of the interesting trends that we're seeing on the global stage is global fertility is below population replacement in a lot of the world. So not just in China is not exempt from this, but most of Europe, certainly Japan, and if you look at the US minus net immigration, all of these places, their populations are in decline. Okay, mm-hmm. And Africa is one of the few places in the world where you actually have robust population growth, which is where your predictions come from about where we will be in 50 years, right? So, but here's the thing, right? If you look at the world today and you extrapolate as far out as you like, when Zimbabweans and other Africans endure economic hardship, where do they immigrate to? Do they go to China? Do they go to Russia? Or do they aspire to go to Europe and the US and these other parts of the West where they can materially improve their quality of life? And I think that's where the game is, right? The game is, as populations decline in the developed world, who can attract the talent from the places that have population growth. And I think that's the game that matters, not coming onto the continent and basically putting your thumb on trade, because the individuals, the arrows of net immigration, right, are going to benefit the West and not China.
I think to get into Europe and the US is just going to be very difficult. It's not the poor that will get into those nations. It will be people who are rich in Africa who will be able to get into those nations.
That's today, but
it's going to become very difficult to get into Europe.
But the population, the demographic challenges are going to get more acute, like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Already in Japan, one of my favorite fun facts.
But Japan is not opening its borders.
No, but they will. When the pressure hits a high enough level, right, and it starts having a severe negative impact on the economy, when they just don't have enough workers, they're going to have to change. It's like what the UK did last year.
So that's an argument I would hear from Ranga, not from you. Because when we talk about AI and what AI is going to do in the future, they won't need that much labor. The sort of labor that they would need is highly skilled. But anyway, we're again moving away from, we're off-ramping. And I don't like us off-ramping because I want us to talk about China and what China is doing. And another misconception, which runs wild in Africa, is that it's state enterprises that are investing in Africa. So it turns out there are over 3,000 Chinese enterprises that are invested in Africa. Guess how many of those are actually private sector? That have nothing to do with the state.
I'd say probably 70%.
Yeah, you're on the money. It's 70% of the 3,000 enterprises that are invested in Africa that are private sector led. It's got nothing to do with the Chinese state. I mean, doesn't that somewhat change your mind? Because it means that it's Chinese entrepreneurs who are seeing the opportunity in Africa. And American entrepreneurs, European entrepreneurs are not seeing it. Now, fair and fine, the risk profile in Africa might not be, attuned to global standards, which is fair enough. But can it be so loop-sided that it's the Chinese that are seeing the opportunities and the Americans and the Europeans are not seeing the opportunities?
Yeah, look, so I think, there's, again, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that China, the nature of the Chinese market is such that if you do incredibly well in China and you become a millionaire or a billionaire, you're always concerned about the risk that you'll wake up one day and find yourself afoul of the CCP, and you'll need to, leave. And the thing about, markets in the West is they're very open and they're extremely competitive. It's very difficult for Chinese capital to actually find a home in these markets, have a competitive advantage, and then do extremely well. But if you look at Africa, for example, because of the geopolitics between Africa and China, the Chinese tend to get favorable treatment on the continent. So an entrepreneur who's finds success in China and wants to diversify their portfolio outside China, but still earn a good return, is more likely to do well in Africa than in Europe or the US. And that's my best guess.
They're always looking
absolutely.
Outwards. I think you make a very good case. Thanks for that, because I think that's a very good remark that you're making. That Africa has provided a platform or has reduced the risk for Chinese investors. And perhaps that's probably what we should do for local investors as well.
For every investor.
Every investor. But what's curious is China itself does that for American investors.
Yes, it does.
It overprotects them in China.
And it makes exceptions. If you look at the only foreign car manufacturer in China that didn't have to form a 50-50 joint venture with a Chinese company, it's Tesla, right? They made an exception for one company to attract that investment.
Yeah.
So I think...
FDI, and more than that, the corporate tax. Do you know what the corporate tax is in China?
No.
It's 16%.
That's quite
But
lucrative,
it's yeah, and it's an exception. So you literally have to go through the bureaucracy, but they will give you 16%. So they do make exceptions. And I think that perhaps that's what Africa is doing. And on that point, because I think you brought up a very good point, is what can African governments do? Or maybe more specifically, because we don't want to speak to Africa, but Zimbabwean government. Knowing that we've got these Chinese investors that are coming. And by the way, that's another misconception. Zimbabwe is not attracting as much Chinese investment as other African nations are.
Certainly as South Africa, as Nigeria, as the bigger markets, for sure.
Even per capita, right? So it means that there's something that we're doing wrong, right? That even the Chinese investors in Zimbabwe are fed up. And we need to get it right. We need to recognize that special treatments, it cuts right across, whether in China or in Africa. What special treatment would you give to our Chinese investors in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, look, I think that you don't want an investment incentive to be linked to geopolitics. The relationship between particular leaders, right? You want to be in a place where you actually don't care. If there's a significant leadership change in China or in Zimbabwe, as an investor, you should be agnostic, right? You should be comfortable that the terms and conditions of your investment, are not going to change in the next 5, 10, 15 years, no matter what happens to
politics.
To the politics. And I think that's
also true of what happens with Western investors that are invested in China.
Absolutely.
Doesn't matter.
So I think, and this is the big challenge with our policy inconsistencies. Look, my best guess, I could be wrong, is that a lot of those entrepreneurs have very high risk appetite. They understand that they have to engage directly with very senior government officials to get assurances, that they will be able to get the returns that they're looking for, and that these assurances are not cast in stone.
Could they have exclusive use of US dollar? Because they don't want this funny money problems, right? If you're going to attract Chinese investors or any investor for that matter, well, let's call them Chinese because it's Chinese investors who are coming here. They don't want funny money.
Nobody wants funny money, right? I mean,
let's leave that exclusively to the locals because we know how to get around it. We're not competing with international destinations for this money, but you have Chinese investors who are coming into Zimbabwe. They don't want funny money. They want their banks here. We haven't attracted a Chinese bank in Zimbabwe. They want their banks. They want their money. They want to be able to move with Chinese financial institutions, with Chinese insurance companies, systems that they understand. And I think that we need to go a little further than what we've done so far and really go overboard in attracting Chinese investors. Because the other thing that I would highlight is the kind of investors we end up with are buccaneers. So even within the Chinese realm, it will be buccaneer Chinese investors. And what we want to investing in our country are the serious Chinese investors.
It's the larger,
and they don't want funny money.
It's the larger institutional money that we want, that will come to Africa and Zimbabwe in a serious way for the long term. I mean, one of the things that blew my mind this week, which is, you alluded to the 51 billion that, okay. But in the same week that we have this announcement, okay, there's a company in the US called Safe Superintelligence, right? It's a startup. It's literally 3 months old. It doesn't really own anything in terms of assets. It employs 10 people, right? And they had a seed funding round where they raised $1 billion at a $5 billion valuation, right? And this is cleared funds in their account. This is not a commitment to future investments. Like, they literally raised this money, right? And this is not backed by a state. This is just a small 10-person startup raising $1 billion. That's 3 months old, raising $1 billion. And we have 53 heads of state travel to China, and the headline investment announcement is $51 billion. So when you think about it in the global context, that if we're celebrating $51 billion, honestly, we're celebrating mediocrity.
Yeah, but it's a start. And the problem is that
But
51...
we've been starting since when, Tinashe?
No, we've actually moved because it used to be 2 billion. So that is 51 billion. You know what? Let's take it for what it is. But I want you to hammer this point again, because I think that it's a serious... When Chinese investors come to Zimbabwe, they do not want their money mixed with funny money. Mm-hmm. And we need to make it very clear to the governor that investors, when they come into Zimbabwe, they don't want funny money.
Look, I mean, I've been in Zimbabwean capital markets for 20 years plus now, and I have colleagues who grew up in Zimbabwe and now allocate capital in Joburg, in London, in New York, and I talk to them all the time, and about investing in Zim, and the conversation always stops at, okay, Rufaro, explain to me. I wire $10 million into Zim. I converted into, what's your current currency called? It's called Zig. Yeah. It's this Zig. And then I buy all these shares on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. Fantastic. You make a bunch of commission. Yay for you. If I want to sell in 2-3 years, because presumably I've done incredibly well based on your advice and I've doubled my money or whatever. Can you guarantee me that I'll be able to convert my proceeds at a fair rate and ship my money back out? And I stutter. I start stuttering. I'm not given to stuttering, but I start stuttering at that point, and that's where the conversation ends, because we can't have a simple conversation about bring in your money, you invest, and then when it's time to harvest, whether it's after 3 months or 5 years or 15 years, can I guarantee that?
So, Rufaro, could we make an exception that if you're a foreign investor, if you come into Zimbabwe, it's a multi-currency system, and we can guarantee for the next 50 years, you bring in your US dollars, you can take your US dollars out. No questions asked. No funny money, no mixing their money with funny money. Because that's what we need.
That's what we need.
That's what we need.
And we've previously made such promises, and sadly, we broke them, right? And so our word is not, impeccable. And I think, and you see, so and also I think from a policy framework standpoint, right? We have all these SIs, statutory instruments, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, when you actually look at the government of the day, right, they control all the important branches of government. They control the executive branch and they control the legislative branch. So we could actually create bills and write laws around this that give people comfort. But we haven't done so, right? For whatever reason, we're enamored with SIs, which can be changed in a heartbeat.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so let's move on to the elephant in the room as far as the Chinese are concerned, and this is Chinese debt. So I think over the last 20 years, I think the Chinese really came into Africa through debt. So a lot of the governments, especially government-to-government debt, and a lot of the governments now are finding it very difficult. I mean, Zambia is a classic case, and they only lent Zambia about $6 billion. No questions asked. Maybe that was the problem that China had. So debt in Ghana, in Zambia, Kenya, we've seen a lot of governments having problems servicing that Chinese debt. To their credit, the Chinese have sort of moved away from just pure debt. But, their debt conditions are extremely onerous.
Yeah, look, I've never liked the debt model. So and okay, I can start at a philosophical level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is I don't think it's a good idea for governments to be able to borrow huge amounts of money, right? That just so because if you think about it from a operational perspective, right? If you as a state are living beyond your means, you can either continue living beyond your means by borrowing, or you can actually cut which is what you're supposed to do when you're living beyond your means. And I find that, it looks like the default setting of governments everywhere when they find themselves living beyond their means is to borrow. And that's not sustainable, and eventually you get to where Africa is
Chinese
today.
were a lot more craftier than that. So the colloquial term is debt diplomacy. So they knew that the World Bank, the IMF, had onerous terms for a lot of these governments, African governments, and they couldn't service.
For good reason.
Yeah, for very good reason. They were bad debtors, and they couldn't service their loans, but they wanted to make inroads into Africa. So it was called debt diplomacy. The whole idea was, okay, forget about the metrics that the World Bank uses or the IMF. We're going to give you debt as long as it's government guaranteed, and we really don't care how you're going to service it. But as far as we're concerned, we now have a relationship with the African states.
We have leverage.
Political
leverage, not just financial leverage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Political leverage. For example, everything that happens at the UN and geopolitical, shenanigans that we know happen. So their leverage was, let's use debt. Now that, unfortunately, and to your point, a lot of the African governments then misuse that debt. And you have Zambia as a classic example where, 20 billion, they owe 20 billion, but 6 billion is Chinese, but that 6 billion is just over a 10-year period. So, and that's really been an albatross in around their neck. So the question is, well, the Chinese, to their benefit, they've moved on, and it's no longer just debt. They're not using
they had this Belt and Road Initiative as well, where they funded all this infrastructure.
So if you look at what, and that's a classic example. If you look at what's happening in China now, is they're funding the railway from DRC, Zambia to Tanzania. And a lot of it is not just debt. A lot of it is actually physical infrastructure spend and investment, which I think is necessary. That's what we need. And perhaps we've also evolved. We've realized that debt, no matter where it's coming from, whether it's Chinese or the Americans or the EU or the World Bank, is problematic. So maybe we have also moved on.
But I think,
and then I want to hear your views. Or the Chinese have succeeded. They now have leverage over Africa. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to answer whether the Chinese have succeeded, but I just want to make this point because I have a lot of these conversations with folks who are quite smart and well informed, and they think that it's one of the central and fundamental roles of government is to build infrastructure. And I actually don't agree with that worldview. If you actually look at the developed world, especially at the time of the Industrial Revolution, if you look at the canals and railways in the UK, if you look at the canals and railways in the US, they were actually built by entrepreneurs and capitalists. They weren't built by government programs. And, I think that this idea that we should have some top-down infrastructure driven, policy and investment, it's wrong. The market should actually figure out that, it makes economic sense for there to be rail between point A and point B. These are the numbers. This is how much capital we need to raise. And the state should simply regulate and say, okay, fine. If you want to build a line between, those 2 points, it must satisfy XYZ conditions. And if you actually look at a lot of the failures in the Belt and Road initiative, it's that they've built things that are engineering marvels that have
zero market,
where there's no market, that don't make economic sense, which is one of the reasons why they've struggled to actually claw back some of the debt associated with those projects, because the project was never economically viable. So that's point number one. Now to come to your question do the Chinese have did they win the geopolitical fight? Do they have all the leverage that they were looking for? And I would make the case that the jury is out on that, because if one of the interesting things about Africa, if you look at us demographically, the pyramid, right? Africa's got a very young population, right? And in as much as you and I on this show like to, opine about things and, philosophize, the people who actually matter are 20 years younger than us.
Gen Z, yeah.
And they've got a completely different lived experience.
That's a very important point. So you're saying that the cultural experience will determine what's going to happen.
Yeah, because that cohort is actually going to decide 10, 20 years from now what our relationship with China is going to be, what our relationship with the West is going to be. And they might actually see things differently than the current cohort who's running Africa.
I'd never thought of that. And I think that's an important thing. So you're saying actually the US has done a lot more in infiltrating into Gen Z, especially in Africa, because it's really Hollywood and the cultural experience, the McDonald's experience. I'm
not making that case. I'm not making the case that anyone is one that bad.
Let me tell you an anecdote. Yeah. So there's a friend who's in Zimbabwe with their kids, and their kids have never been to Zim. And, mommy decided, what, let me bring over the kids to Zim so that they experience, the Zim that we grew up in.
Zimbabwean culture.
Yeah. So when they get to the airport and they're like, mommy, everywhere where we've gone, we've tasted a McDonald's. I want to see a McDonald's.
Yeah.
And
there's no McDonald's in them for sure.
But that's besides the point, because the point that you're making is actually that's the difference between our generations, because this is the new generation. Their worldview
is different from ours.
It's different from us, and it's been infiltrated by a cultural experience which is primarily Western. So,
look, I'm not going to.
So the West does not need to invest in Africa, because they've done the most important thing, which is to change or to affect the cultural experience in Africa.
I'm not going to call it one way or the other, which is why, my view is the jury's out, right?
But it's a very important point you're making.
But I think, so the Chinese have made all these investments over the last 10 years, and they enamored with the current political class today, right? But I have no idea what 20 years from now that, the political class is going to look like and think. And maybe the Chinese will have won the day, and it'll be clear. Okay. That's when the jury will be out.
So that's another rabbit hole for the audience. You can think about this in 60, 70 years' time. Are people more likely to be speaking in Mandarin than in English? What sort of cars are we likely to be driving? Are we more likely to be driving a Tesla or
a BYD?
BYD? Are we likely to be, our phones, are we likely to have a Chinese phone? Because that's a real cultural experience, and that's probably going to determine what the trade will look like in 50, 60 years' time. That's a very good point. Back on infrastructure. So we're taking a segue and back to our roads in Zimbabwe. We've seen the government make the infrastructure spend. What's your view? I mean, Harare is looking a little better.
It's looking much better. Look, I'm going to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah. So let's talk about that.
One of the things, that I am grateful for in the context of the SADC summit, because, look, and it's got nothing to do with the summit being in Zimbabwe, by the way. These summits have been happening for the last, as far as I can remember. And
no, the last one was 10 years ago in 2014.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I that Mugabe didn't care.
I remember Chogam. I was growing up.
1994.
I was at school. It was in Vic Falls, and the Queen came over.
The All Africa Games in 1995.
But what I'm saying is, the point I want to make is, all of these things tend to be talk shows, and when they're over, we've got absolutely nothing to show for it. But this one, we actually have something to show for it. We have a bunch of roads that were fixed up for the purposes of this conference, and the conference is over, and the roads are still looking good. So that's a positive, right? And I think
at what cost, I suppose. So looking at the financing models.
Yeah, look. Obviously, the financing model is wrong. We didn't raise new capital, long-term capital, because a road, if it's built properly, is supposed to have a multi-decade lifespan. And you are supposed to fund a project like that with multi-decade funding. And I know for a fact that we did not raise any multi-decade funding to build any of these roads. So that's obviously,
Do you buy into, the new city in Mazoe, new corridors being opened, new channels?
Oh no! I mean, I think that I've never. So that entire project for me is, it's a white elephant. It's. So, if you think about it philosophically, right? We have this Parliament building in the CBD, right? And then in our infinite wisdom, we decided that we needed more parliamentarians. So already at that point, I have opprobrium for that worldview. We're a poorer country than the UK, so we should have a higher MP to constituents ratio than the Brits, right? To save money. Okay,
No, true.
But we don't. Right?
We
We decided
before 2005, it used to be 120. Yeah, it was actually
exactly.
120.
Why do we have more than 120? Why do we need more than 120? Right? I mean, it's remarkable to me.
I see your point. So I agree as far as Mazoe being a city or new city.
It's completely unnecessary.
Okay,
But we've built it. I think so. It's there. We can't pretend that it's not there.
Yeah, but I think where the roads are going to make a difference, it's in densification and development of, inner Harare. Because I think that's going to make a big difference.
Look, I think,
and I sort of agree.
So
with
you're right.
Harare
So it's like
City
if you think about Rua, if you think about and it's probably going to expand into Koromonzi. So our population is growing. Harare is growing. So it does make it easier to expand into.
I'm not talking about expanding. I'm talking about densification. That actually we were sparsely densified, and we actually need to increase the density.
But that's already happening. Like if you think about all these clusters,
and I'm saying
mushrooming
and
everywhere.
I'm saying the opening of the roads makes that even better.
Look,
which I think is a positive.
I'm all for widening the roads. I'm all for that infrastructure spend. I think it's fantastic. I love that our government is concerned about infrastructure development and investment. My only admonition is that we are wiser about funding it.
Yeah, because it came with inflation.
Absolutely.
It literally debased all our currency.
Well, yeah.
Which is totally unnecessary.
Debased our local currency.
Yeah, debased our local currency, which is totally unnecessary. So let's look at a viable funding model. What could be a viable funding model? Because clearly the need is there, and government can see the need. But what could be a funding model that's viable where private sector could participate? Could you see, for example, maybe land for roads? Deals,
no, I think there's a much simpler model. It's called build, operate, transfer.
Okay.
So you just basically say anybody who's interested in investing in infrastructure, build it, operate it, claw back with tolls and recoup your money. Once you've recouped your money, you transfer it to the state. I think those are fantastic models. And what you'll find is entrepreneurs will look at the unmet needs. They'll look at where we have congestion, where we have all these challenges, and they'll make the necessary investments. I mean, if you think about rail, for example, the state of NRZ, which is now part of Mutapa, there's a huge case to be made for, us to be moving 100 times more tonnage via rail than we are today.
Well,
right?
not just haulage, but actually not just cargo,
but passengers as well.
Passengers, because especially if we are thinking of densification, and that's another thing that we need to talk about, because we saw the Minister of Transport coming up with these restrictions on combis, that combis cannot go more than 60 kilometers. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, here we are, we've opened up the roads, and then the same minister comes back to us and tells us that combis can only, drive a radius of 60 kilometers.
Look,
more and more regulation.
As a libertarian, I abhor regulations. But I think, one of the most ungovernable courts in our country are the combis. Look, bless them. They move people, who have no alternative in terms of getting from A to B. So I will give them credit for meeting that essential need, but the way they behave is absolutely abhorrent. And so I in this particular instance, in as much as I'm not for my default setting is less regulation is better. But in this particular instance,
But how's that going to help?
Look, I think.
And are you ever going to stop them? Because what naturally happens is corruption, rent seeking. We know that the police are corrupt. We know that everybody is corrupt in Zimbabwe.
So I think
it's not going to help.
I think the challenge,
the regulation, because whenever you see new regulation, just know that you're just increasing the premium for rent seeking.
Look, I think the challenge that we have here is and my intuition is that you're right on this. The reason why you don't see a lot of significant corporate investment in the public transport space is because of this rent-seeking regulation that you're speaking to, right? So if I've got a bunch of capital and I can see that there's an unmet need, right? People would rather be in a safer, cleaner transport option instead of a combi, right? And I'm a capital allocator. I've got the capacity to throw 50 million US at the problem. And I start to, come up with a solution. Then I meet the regulator. And then the guy says, you know what? You need to jump through all these hoops, okay?
True.
Before
anything can happen. Yeah.
And then I just think,
Rufaro, don't you think that there's an opportunity here, especially as far as rail is concerned? So if you look at the UK, you do have private rail systems.
Yeah,
especially within inner city, Virgin being a particular one. Could we see that? Because with the densification of Harare, there is a case that can be made for a railway system. Rua, Chitungwiza.
No, absolutely. Like
inner city. And
I'm totally sold.
And probably what government needs to do, what the Minister of Transport needs to focus on, is allowing private sector.
I'm totally sold. So the challenges, and I'll give you an anecdotal example, of something that that probably just if you look at the geography of sub-Saharan Africa, Harare is actually a much more natural hub for regional and international flights on the continent and internationally than Johannesburg. Okay, just true. If you look at where we are,
even cargo moving up to Central Africa, East Africa,
and I remember growing up when it was a thing to actually go to the airport to see off people or.
It's still a thing.
No, I don't do it anymore.
It's still a thing. You don't do it, but lots of people still do it.
And, I remember seeing KLM, Air France, all the world's major airlines would fly directly into Harare. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Okay, I mean, it's not as bad as it was like in 2008, 2007. So you've got, Ethiopian and Qatar and Emirates and all these, big international airlines flying into Harare. But you don't see, KLM, you don't see Delta Airlines, you don't see British Airways, you don't see, some of the other major global airlines, which is sad, right? Because it makes sense. The traffic would be there. A lot of people who travel to Harare have to lay over in places like Dar or Dubai. And if they had the option to fly direct, they would. And my best guess is the reason why we still don't see these direct flights is because of all the red tape, right? Somebody says, listen, I want to organize a direct flight into Harare. They sit in a bunch of meetings, their head explodes.
And they move away.
And they say,
which is quite unfortunate because, what speaks to the point that you're making, since Rhodesian times, Zim has always had a competitive advantage as a national hub, right? A network hub, whether it's road, rail, air.
Yeah.
Zim, where it's placed geographically, it's a natural, node for going into Central
Absolutely,
Africa,
absolutely.
going into East Africa.
I'll share one more anecdote.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, please go ahead.
Like a decade ago, I did a road trip to Blantyre in Malawi. I was exploring some opportunity there, and the guy I traveled with shared with me a newspaper clip from the late 70s, showing that we used to do 36 flights, direct flights, between Harare and Blantyre a week. Right, but now today, if you want to,
during the Federation.
yeah, if you need to travel to Blantyre, right, and you want to fly, you don't want to do a road trip, because a road trip you have to go to Nyamapanda, then you go to Tete, then you go to the Mozambique. Tete, sorry, jeez, my bad. you have to then from Tete you have to drive to the Mozambique Malawi border, and then from there you have to drive to Blantyre. Okay,
yeah.
But if you want to fly, right, you have to do Harare, Joburg. Then, if you're lucky, you're gonna get a Joburg Blantyre. Otherwise, you do.
Is Malawi not flying anymore?
Oh, like sometimes they fly, sometimes they don't. Like such a tiny. And if you do fly Air Malawi on a route like that, it's one of these tiny planes.
Over. Yeah, and stopping over.
You don't want to do that.
Totally. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Airzim should do. Airzim should not be in the business of flying anyone. They should just be in the business of managing the routes, because they do have particular, very profitable routes, like Harare to London.
Yeah, I mean we could easily do like 3, 4, 5 flights a week.
No, every day. Just the amount of people who are moving between Harare and London. It's just
it's big enough.
It's big enough. Okay, so let's talk about. We're almost done.
Well, we can the producer's not here, so we can make this show as long as we like.
Let's talk about the good rainy season forecast. So we've had a bad year.
We've had a drought. It's not a bad year. It's a drought. It's a bad drought. And Kariba is not generating any. Is not going to be generating any power because of how bad the drought is.
But the forecast is looking very favorable. No more to good. Well, good to more than good. I don't know what they call it. Rainy season. What are your views? Are we prepared for it? Are we not? As far as the seed is concerned, as far as the farmers are concerned, because usually what happens is if we have a bad season, it's very difficult for us to recover in the next season, primarily because the subsistent farmers don't have any seed whatsoever. So could this be an opportunity where government starts planning now for that particular season, or are we just going to waste it?
So I think it's an opportunity for us to rethink how we do agriculture in Zimbabwe. Look, we will do better next year because there's more rain. But I think our challenge, the reason why we punch way below our weight in agriculture, is because of the framework. So we had land reform in 2002. We were net exporters of grain before that. With the exception of 2 years ago when we had a fantastic rainy season, we imported more than 1 million tons of maize every year. So yeah, we'll have a better season. I'm not a fan of government programs, whether it's the presidential input scheme or command agriculture, whatever you want to call it, where we hand out seed and all these other freebies in the hope of incentivizing better production. I'm a believer in the market and incentives, free market. If I have title deeds to my farm and I get rich if I am highly productive, and I can put up my title as collateral, I can invest in my land, plow it into irrigation, into infrastructure that's going to increase the odds of me coming out at the end of the season with a fantastic harvest, that's going to increase my revenues and my net profits. That's what's going to turn agriculture around in Zim, right? This idea that, let's think about what the weather is going to be like next year. It's we're going to get a bunch more rain.
And then start planning. Okay, so let's be a little practical. How are farmers going to recover from what they lost last year? And we've got Ranga as our resident pseudo farmer.
Okay, he identifies as a farmer.
Identifies as a farmer. But he had a total write-off, and that's nothing
Exactly.
unusual,
So-
nothing
so-
unique.
so he
a lot
has-
of farmers had total write-offs. How are they going to recover? Because I think that's what's going to impact.
So exactly,
on,
so you're
on
gonna
what
have
we eventually.
some guys able to raise capital and reinvest, and you're gonna, and unfortunately, some guys are just gonna. They were carried out in the last season, and they have no capacity, and unfortunately, the state also has significantly less capacity because the formal sector is shrinking, so formal tax revenues have shrunk. The platinum prices
what
have
could
taken
we
a
do
beat.
in the future? What could we do in the future?
Oh,
Just
the right
to-
thing. The right thing. We could actually issue people with letters of allocation title.
All right. So that they invest in water bodies, private money.
Because once you have title, you can raise money in a way that you can't today. You can't go anywhere with an offer letter and say, hey, I had a really bad season last year. I need 100K, and my security is my tenure. Please, mortgage this letter of allocation. I mean, come on.
Yeah. So we're going back to the theory around free market capitalism and why
There's
that is
billions
actually
of dollars that
necessary.
are tied.
It's for
that are
simple things
trapped
like that.
in-
How do
in
we
the-
recover from a drought? Because if people had title, then they would make the investments to ameliorate themselves from any downside.
Absolutely.
Insurance companies will be willing to play ball. This is why title is very, very, very important.
And I don't understand it because even if you think about it from the perspective of the people who've benefited the most from land reform, right? Unless you're immortal, and you're gonna die one day, right? And you hopefully want your children to benefit from your endowment with this land, right? So how do you have any assurance that your kids are going to benefit from your endowment with this land if you don't have title? If on your death, the minister of the day can simply allocate it to someone else. Like surely if it's in the interests of the biggest beneficiaries of land reform to actually have title.
Absolutely. Rufaro, that was great. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah, this was
We've
good
got-
fun. We
Yeah,
should
good
have
fun.
more of these where the producers are.
And we can express ourselves fully. Yeah. What are you looking forward to this coming week?
Oh, this coming week, there's not much I'm looking forward to. I'm doing a trail run in 2 weeks in Nyanga. It's called Run Nyanga, where we're gonna hike. Well, it's a run, but nobody actually runs up to the peak of Mount Nyangani. So that's gonna be good fun. That's
Today we do have a bride.
Oh, okay, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Yes,
Speak to that.
Yes, we've got a good friend of ours in our guest lounge who has joined us all the way from Kenya and has sponsored a braai. And
We're very grateful.
We're very grateful, and we're going to have a bunch of fun later today. Absolutely. I'm quite excited about that.
I'm looking forward to it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. This was fantastic. This was great. Please continue to like, share, subscribe, and comment. Disagree, agree, but let's get the conversation going. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful spring evening and enjoy and a wonderful weekend.
So who do you think is going to win on tomorrow? The All Blacks are playing the Box in Cape Town.
I think the All Blacks, primarily because I think that they have a lot to prove.
Yeah. I mean,
especially
it was
what
quite close at
happened,
altitude last week, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because of
Yeah,
what happened last week, I think that they've a lot to prove. So,
I like the narrative.
I know.
I like the narrative. I quite like the narrative.
Not that I have any bone in the match. I'm agnostic as long as it's good rugby.
It's going to be
I'm
fantastic
happy.
rugby.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's been great so far. So as long as it's good rugby, I'm for it.
Yeah, fantastic.
And we all know who you're
Rooting for.
Yeah.
Yes, I will be standing in black.
Okay. Thank you very much, and enjoy your weekend. Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah, that was good fun.